The planet never slept, not in the way Earth did with its familiar rhythm of night and day here under twin suns that took turns warming the land like in diff. Gods the world only dimmed, it never truly darkened, even in its quietest moments this place breathed heat, whispered dust, and watched from behind. Rust-red ridges like something ancient and waiting, Jack Dren paused at the edge of a narrow canyon ledge, boots scuffing. Rock baked near glass, by decades of exposure, his fingers twitched on the grip of his sensor pad, but his eyes weren't on the relay tower in the distance. They were staring into the light, not at it, through the orange glare and ochre dust that hung constantly in the sky like powdered rust. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but something in his chest had gone still. He hadn't spoken to another human in 12 days, not since the cargo hauler dropped him off with half-working parts, a 6-we repair order, and a corporate message that didn't quite say expendable, but implied it strongly. He preferred it that way alone, simple, efficient, safe. This was Salve, one of the outer rim exoplanets on the edge of corporate expansion. Not much to look at: dry gorges, scattered minerals, dangerously erratic weather, but breathable air, and rare, or beneath the crust, made it just useful enough to fight over. There were rumors of old alien ruins buried deeper in the canyons, but no one with a corporate badge had ever confirmed them. It wasn't part of Jack's job to care. He was here to fix solar relays one panel at a time, and keep the grid online just long enough for the main survey ship to finish mapping the terrain. 6 weeks, then a ride back to the core worlds. That was the plan until he heard it. At first, he thought it was wind whistling through a rock arch. Then he stopped moving, turned, listened. It came again, thin and high-pitched, not mechanical, not weather. A sound of pain in it. Jack's spine stiffened. Every instinct told him to ignore it, not his problem, not part of the job, but his legs moved anyway. He started down the ridge, carefully navigating the tilted slabs of shale and razor grass, thin-spiked plants that coiled slightly in the heat and snapped. Shot of touch, the air shimmered in waves. Distant dunes shifted under the weight of passing wind, throwing up fine silt that clung to the skin and eyes. Even in his breathing mask, Jack could taste the minerals, bitter, metallic like a battery on the tongue. As he moved, the cry returned, broken, now strained. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was the last thread of something that didn't expect help to come. He followed it down a narrow gully, but between boulders crusted in red lion spiny plants with translucent stems curled in the shadows, their surfaces pulsing faintly with bioluminescence. The air grew colder here, shaded but heavy, like something had happened in this place, and the land hadn't quite exhaled. Since then, he saw it movement, a tangle of limbs, blood dark smears on stone. He froze. It was a trap, old world, brutal, barbed steel and bone rigging stretched between two low rock formations. But what it had caught wasn't a creature from this world, not quite. Suspended in the snare, half curled in agony, was a figure unlike anything Jack had ever seen in the flesh. Humanoid, yes, but not human. Her skin was blue, but not flat like paint, layered with subtle iridescence, shifting hues beneath the surface like stormlight water. Long strands of green hair, deep emerald, threaded with lighter tones, clung to her sweat, slick skin, and pulled on the stone. Beneath her she was tangled, one leg twisted awkwardly, arms caught in the wiring. Blood had dried on her thigh and shoulder. It was darker than human blood, almost purple. A soft, rapid breath escaped her lips. Her eyes opened. They were unlike any eyes he'd seen, wide, luminous silver with shifting vertical slits, cat-like and alien, and utterly, completely focused on him, not wild with fear, not begging, just watching, calculating. He raised a hand. Easy. She flinched at the sound, her body twisted in a sharp defensive motion that made her gasp in pain. Her fingers scraped at the trap supports, trying to pull herself free despite the damage. Don't, Jack said more to himself than her. He stepped forward, crouched beside the snare, and scanned it. Human portable, old military salvage, probably left behind by some unauthorized poacher or survivalist. The trip wire had snapped from below, activated by ground pressure. Someone had set this, not recently, but not long ago either. He scanned the ridge above. Nothing, still. The back of his neck prickled. He turned back to her. She made a low sound, not a word, not a moan. It was melodic, a chim-like hum from deep in her chest, trembled by pain, but intentional, not human, not a language he knew. But it struck him somewhere he couldn't explain. It wasn't just a Vocalization, it was a message his eyes flicked down around her neck caught in. The blood-streaked fabric of a torn vest hung a small iridescent pendant shaped. Like an oval shard of polished glass it glowed, faintly, no text signature not. Active, just warm, she made the sound again, softer this time. Jack exhaled and pulled out his heat knife. Her pupils contracted at the sight of it. She tensed. Ready to fight, but she didn't move, didn't scream, didn't plead. He moved, and slowly, "I'm cutting you out of this," he muttered, even though he knew she didn't understand. He placed his gloved hand on the metal wiring and pressed the knives. Blade to the anchor, the tool hissed, metal curling away with a sharp smell. One coil snapped, then another. She hissed sharply, but didn't cry out her blood. Stuck to his gloves, thick and warm. "Just hold still," he said as he worked a. Thought came unbidden. She's not the first one to scream here. There were stains on the stone, old, nearly black. More than one. This wasn't the first use of this trap. He looked around again. Jaw tight. Was someone watching the last wire? Snapped. She collapsed against him with no strength to resist. Reflexively, he caught her arms beneath her back and legs. Her body was light but dense, as though her bones carried something heavier than calcium. She trembled against his chest. Her breathing was shallow and fast, but her eyes, they were still watching him, not afraid, not trusting, just studying. Jack stood adjusting her weight in his arms. His camp was 4 km east, barely within range. If he cut across the lower basin and avoided the ridge the sun had shifted, the heat would start to spike again. Soon he'd have to hurry. He looked down at her. Again, "What the hell were you doing out here?" he murmured. No answer, just the sound of her breathing and the faint hum of her pendant against his chest. He began walking, dust kicking up behind him. Every step loud in the canyon, strange hush. She didn't speak, he didn't ask, but as the shadows stretched around them and the sky dimmed from bright gold to bruised orange, Jack had the unmistakable sensation that something was watching them, still out there waiting. And as the alien woman in his arms shifted faintly, one hand curling into his jacket with unconscious trust, he realized something else. He didn't want to be alone anymore. Not really, not like this. Maybe he never had, and maybe, just maybe, this strange, blue-skinned woman bleeding in his arms wasn't a burden. Maybe she was the reason he was still out here at all. Jack didn't stop moving, not even a wipe. The sweat trickling down his spine beneath the exoit back plate. The alien woman in his arms was growing heavier with every step. Not because she'd gained weight, but because the situation was starting to settle in his chest like stone. Her blood had soaked into the fabric of his sleeve, staining it deep violet. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, each one a quiet struggle, but she was still conscious. That was something. The path ahead cut through a dry ravine, scattered with razor grass, rust-colored moss, and the occasional thistle burst, a plant that looked like a cluster of feathers, until it released spore darts sharp enough to draw blood. Jack moved carefully, boots finding their rhythm on the loose stone. Knowing every wasted second counted. If her body was anything like a human's, she was going into shock. If it wasn't, she might already be dying, and he just didn't know it yet. His rover was just under 4 clicks east, nestled inside a rock alcove to shield it from solar winds and storms. The terrain between here and there wasn't forgiving. Sand patches that swallowed your ankles, jagged outcrops that could turn misstep into a broken leg, and the worst of it, open sky, no cover. And if whoever set that trap was still out there watching, Jack's jaw clenched. He kept scanning the cliffs around them, eyes flicking to each rise and dip, but nothing moved. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the airhead eyes, that this part of the canyon was marked, somehow tainted by violence, by silence, by something old that didn't care for trespassers. Her fingers twitched against his chest. Jack glanced down. Her head had turned slightly, forehead resting against his shoulder, lips parted, those silver gold eyes opened just enough to meet his. Still wary, still watching, but softer now. Her breath carried something else this time, an almost imperceptible sound, like a half-hum note, not the melodic pulse from earlier. Softer, maybe a question, maybe a plea. He didn't answer, couldn't. What could he say instead? He adjusted his grip and kept moving. The rover came into view 40 minutes later, low slung and dust streak one of its solar panels half folded after last week's Micker storm. It wasn't much, but it was home for now, a sealed unit with 2 bunks, a field medkit, and just enough power to run essential systems. He climbed the last stretch of rock, activated the hatch remotely, and stepped inside. as the seal closed behind them with a low hiss. The filtered air was cool dry, and faintly metallic. Jack set her down gently on an narrow cot and stepped back, hands trembling now that he was no longer in motion. He pulled off his gloves and crouched beside her, checking her leg. The wound had deepened during the carry. The muscle had torn against the edge of the trap's pressure clamp, not fatal, but without proper treatment, infection would set in fast. Okay, he muttered to himself. Let's hope you're not allergic to synthetic polymers. He opened the medkit, scanned the contents, and grabbed the bioscanner. The device wasn't calibrated for alien biology, but it might pick up vitals. He ran it over her chest and shoulders, a flickering pulse elevated. Temperature, oxygen saturation, something not a total blank. It was enough to try. He cleaned the wound as best he could, wincing when she jerked under his touch. Her hand gripped the edge of the cot. She was biting down hard, eyes squeezed shut, but she didn't cry out. Jack muttered soft reassurances without thinking, nonsense words, more tone than meaning. Almost there, just another second. Okay, pressure's off now. He applied the sealant and WRA her leg, tightly stabilizing the limb with a carbon split. Then he cleaned the cuts on her shoulder and the thin abrasions across her ribs, her skin cooler than his smooth like stone, polished by centuries of wind, shivered under his fingers at one point. She opened her eyes again, not in fear, in observation, measuring him, studying him, as if try to map his intentions through touch. Alone, the pendant around her neck pulsed, softly, faint as a heartbeat. He reached for it once, curious, but her hand darted up and closed around it. Her eyes narrowed. He raised both hands and backed off. All right, yours. Got it. She didn't relax, but she didn't lash out either. She slowly lowered her hand, keeping the pendant close to her chest. Jack stood and crossed the small cabin, trying not to look like he was packing. He ran a systems check. The communications array was still damaged from the last storm. He could send a short burst signal tomorrow morning when the satellite passed overhead again, maybe if the relay tower hadn't completely given out, and even then it would take a week for anyone to reach this sector. He turned back toward the cot. She had fallen asleep or passed out. Hard to tell. Her chest rose and fell in slow, measured rhythm. One hand had curled beside her face, and for a second, just a second, she didn't look like something strange dropped into his life by a cruel universe. She just looked tired. Jack leaned against the wall beside the viewport and looked out. Across the rocks beyond, the twin suns had begun to set together, casting a dual shadow that stretched his silhouette in two directions. The red haze outside swirled gently like it was alive. He used to love sunsets. He grown up on mining colonies where sunrises were hidden behind atmospheric filters and orbital smock. Out here it was clean, raw, but the sky never let you forget that it could kill you in an instant if you misstepped. That was the part he liked. He closed his eyes and let the quiet settle in. The sound of filtered air, the hum of cooling systems, the faint rhythmic breathing of the alien woman. Across the room it should have been peaceful, but something gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. The trap, too old to be fresh, too intact to have been abandoned long ago. Someone had been nearby, maybe still was, maybe watching. Jack's eyes drifted to the rifle mounted near the door. He hadn't needed it in weeks. He pulled it down, loaded it, and set it beside the cot. Then he sat on the floor, not tired enough to sleep, not alert enough to do anything else. The alien woman stirred slightly in her sleep, one leg shifting beneath the blanket. Her mouth moved, forming words he couldn't understand, or maybe it was just breath, maybe dreams. She didn't look like a threat, but that didn't mean she was safe, and it didn't mean he was ready for what her arrival would bring. Jack rested his head back against the cold metal wall, eyes open, staring into nothing. He had come to this planet to escape, to fix machines, not people, to bury noise and silence. But silence, it turned out, was fragile, and sometimes it screamed. Loudest of all, the storm came like a predator. It didn't announce itself with clouds or thunder. It came with stillness, the kind of titans that adjust before a kill. Jack had been outside adjusting the rovers' secondary heat vents when he felt it, pressure dropping, light shifting, the hair on his arms rising without explanation. He looked up. The twin suns had dimmed, but not behind clouds. The sky was bleeding red. Dust high in the atmosphere swirled like smoke across a bruised horizon. It wasn't whether it was a wall miles high, moving fast, alive. His Gut turned cold. He shouted, already running towards the passenger door. Inside now. She appeared in the doorway. A second later, eyes narrowed against the light. What is it? Storm front, red level. Movie pushed her in and slammed the hatch shut, just as the first wave of wind slammed into the ridge behind them. The entire rover shook, with the force of its stabilizers groaning against the strain. Dust hit the outer shell like hail, no, not hail, like shrapnel sand. Carried with it the sharpness of shattered glass. Ra gripped the console beside her, steadying herself. This is not normal, no, Jack said, tightly sliding into the command seat and firing up the storm. Protocols. This is the kind of storm that eats machines for breakfast. The environmental sensors flared red. External visibility dropped to zero. Lightning forked across the sky, silent. White, unnatural. For a moment, Jack saw the ridge they climbed earlier illuminate in full, and then vanish again. Swallowed whole. We're losing power. His voice was calm, but clipped. Secondary systems are kicking in, but the core is unstable. How long can it hold? He checked. The coolant pressure not long enough. Outside, the storm howled like something living and vengeful. The metal plating screamed, as if being peeled away by claws. The comms panel sparked once, twice, then went dark. Total signal loss. Inside the rover, everything flickered. Lights danced, then died. Only the emergency beacon stayed on a faint blue pulse, beating like a dying heart. The wind tore at the hull again. Suddenly, a high-pitched snap, sharp and wrong, echoed through the floor. Jack cursed under his breath. Cores cracked. He turned to Ra. She didn't need translation. Her face said it all, understanding, fear, and something else. Focus. We need a brace for failure, he said. This thing blows. We're gone with it. He pulled down the emergency containment kit, tossing her one of the impact cloaks. She caught it, already fastening it across her shoulders. What do we do? Jack's hands were already moving, grabbing 2 packs and stripping the rover of anything useful: rations, medkits, heat coils, water canisters, and AV tablet. We survive. We walk to where there's a mining relay. North Basin, old, probably half dead, but might still have an uplink. She didn't question him, didn't flinch. She grabbed her boots and slid them on, wincing slightly as her healing leg stretched. The wind outside shrieked louder, an unearthly, endless scream. The storm wanted them to hear it, to know it owned this land. The back panel of the rover blew open, torn straight off by pressure surge. Wind and red sand exploded inward. Jack lunged, slammed the emergency hatch control, and it jammed. The panel stuttered halfway, whining like a wounded animal. Ra was already moving, grabbing a stabilizer rod and bracing the hatch seal. It jacked up forward and hit the manual override. The panel groaned, slowly descending until it locked shut. Silence returned, not peace, just pause. The kind of silence that follows an impact. The lights were gone. The power core hummed softly, now flickering like a failing heartbeat. Ra stood still, cloak wrapped tight, her braid flung over one shoulder. Face streaked with sand that was close. Jack looked at her, really looked. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't falling apart. She was here, steady, and somehow that mattered more than anything. He noted once, yeah, too close. They left it first light, what was left of it. Anyway, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world rearranged. Dunes that hadn't existed the day before now rose high, overshadowed canyons. The sky was dim and colorless. Everything looked scorched. Jack adjusted the straps of his pack and checked the nav tablet. 16 km to the basin's edge. Another 30 after that. Rise said nothing, just started walking. The land was brutal. Slopes of cracked salt and stone, jagged spires, bent from centuries of wind. The bones of old mining rigs, rusted and half buried in dust, the wind had carved everything into strange, sharp beauty. Nothing here was soft, nothing was meant to last. They walked in silence. By noon, Ra was limping again. Jack offered her a brace. She took it without a word. They passed a dried riverbed with a twisted remain of a skimmer drone, half submerged in the sediment. Its plating have been torn off, not by weather. Someone's been here, Jack muttered. Not recently, Rise said, eyes scanning the canyon. But not long ago either. They moved faster after that. By evening, the air turned cold. The suns dropped behind the ridge lines, and shadows stretched like claws. They found shelter beneath a sloped overhang of rock. Old wind smooth, pitted with dust pockets. Jack set up the heat coil while Ra leaned against the stone, one leg outstretched. Her breathing was shallower now. Jack crouched beside her, pulled out the medkit. Let me see. She hesitated. Please, she nodded, and let him unwrap the brace. The wound had reopened slightly. Red around the edges but not infected, yet he cleaned in silence movements. Gentle, deliberate, her skin felt clinched once beneath his touch, but she didn't pull away. You should have said something. He murmured, I don't want to slow us down, we move at your pace, that's not changing. Rayla's eyes searched his why do you care. Jack froze, he wasn't sure how to answer that. Not completely, but finally he said, because you're not just a passenger, you're part of this now. Whether you meant to be or not. She nodded, said nothing, but something in her softened later after they had eaten. Jack laid back against his pack, staring up at the alien stars. There were too many, too bright, the constellations made no sense. Ross sat beside him, her hair down now loose and tangled from the wind. She stared at the sky as if it meant something. He turned to her. What do you see up there? She smiled faintly. Not home. But not alone either. He watched her. You ever think you'd end up here? He cracked an eye open. Shoot, why do you always walk ahead? Jack tilted his head. Habit, I guess, but you look back often. He didn't answer right away. Because I'm used to being left behind, she said quietly. I thought it was your way of preparing me for it. Jack sat up. The bluntness of her words caught him off guard. That's not why, he said. I look back to make sure you're still there. Ra held his gaze for a long moment, then very slowly she nodded. They didn't speak again until nightfall that evening. They found a shallow ridge with an overhang of stone, just wide enough to sit side by side beneath. Jack lit the coil and the warmth began to spread. Between them, the stars above emerged one by one, cleaner and sharper than he remembered. Too sharp to feel familiar. Jack woke to the sound of soft wind brushing over the ridge above them, a dry sigh slipping across the rocks. He blinked into the half-light of salvia. Dawn, the twin suns just beginning to crawl over the horizon, bathing the sky in a muted blend of orange and violet. The stars were still fatting, reluctant to let go beside him. Ra was still asleep. Her breath soft, slow. She lay curled beneath the thermal blanket, one hand resting near her collarbone, her lips parted slightly as she murmured faint words in her native tongue. Unintelligible, gentle, like pieces of music, half lost in memory. Jack didn't move, not yet. He watched her in silence, the weight of the last days pressing gently against his chest. The dust in her hair glimmered like fine crystal. The bruise along her temple had faded into something shallow, and the tension that had once lived in her shoulders was gone. If only for this one moment. It was the first time he'd seen her truly rest. He exhaled and stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his back muscles ocked in protest. He shook it off. They had a long day ahead. The basin was still ahead of them, and they needed to cross it before heat reached its peak. He unpacked the last of the dried ration bars, divided them evenly, and filled 2 canisters from the purifier pouch. When he crouched to set one beside her, her eyes opened. No alarm, no startle, just quiet awareness. Morning, he said. She blinked, adjusted to the light, then sat up with a WSC. How long did I sleep? 7 hours. Her brow lifted. Almost teasing. You counted. He allowed a crooked smile. You snore a little easy, too. Track. She narrowed her eyes. I do not. You absolutely do. Ra stared at him for a moment, then gave a soft exhale that might have been a laugh, or the closest thing she could offer. It was real. That was enough. They ate in silence, but the kind that had weight, not distance. A shared rhythm had begun to form, every motion, every decision taken together. Jack didn't have to ask if she was ready to move. He just looked at her as she nodded. They walked. The salt basin stretched out before them, vast and gleaming in the morning sun. It shimmered with heat illusions that danced like spirits on the horizon beneath their feet. The ground cracked and splintered beneath each step, forming strange geometries that spider-webbed outward. With every crunch of their boots for hours, they said little. At midday, the suns converged overhead. The heat began to press down like a weight on their backs. Jack called for a stop. They huddled under the angled shadow of a rock plate jutting out from the basin floor, drinking sparingly and checking the nav. The uplink tower was close. Closer than Jack had hoped. Maybe another day, maybe less if they could push. As Jack leaned back, eyes closed, Ra turned to him, her voice soft. May I ask something? As they sat in silence, Ra reached up and unfastened the top of her travel suit just enough to reveal a series of delicate symbols inked into the side of her neck, subtle, iridescent. In the firelight, not tattoos exactly, not scars either. Jack tilted his head. What are those? She hesitated, then touched one gently, memories etched in. Like my people, we don't write books the way yours do we. We're what we survive, he stared, so each one is something you live. Through she nodded, or someone I carry with me, Jack swallowed, do you regret? Coming here, Ra looked up at the stars, no, I thought I would, but I don't even. With the trap, the storm, all of this, her voice dropped, because of it there was a pause, then she said, almost a whisper, you remind me of someone I lost, not in how you look, but in how you wait, how you don't speak what you feel. My people are quiet, but your silent hides too. Much. Jack looked away. Maybe that's why I like machines better than people. Machines don't leave, they don't chain. But they don't hold you either, she said. Jack looked at her surprised. Ra leaned in slowly, deliberately, and placed her hand over his. You hold your grief like a weight on your back. He couldn't speak. I see it, even when you try to hide it in strength, even when you think you're helping me, you're carrying both of us. You looked down. I don't know how else to be, she said. Nothing. Then very gently she shifted forward enough to close the space between them. Her forehead rested lightly against his. A weary gesture, one Jack had come to recognize. Not a kiss, not yet, but something more primal, closer, a touch of warmth. He didn't move. She whispered, you don't have to carry everything, Jack. And with that she closed her eyes, resting against him fully, her arms folded around herself, but her presence pressed close to his. Jack slowly, carefully wrapped his arm around her shoulders. He exhaled long and slow and rested his cheek against her hair. They stayed like that for a long time, two silhouettes against the stone, surrounded by stars, warmth and silence, not born of loneliness, but of understanding. Neither of them said good night. They didn't need to. For the first time, the space between them wasn't filled with what they feared, but what they trusted. Something fragile had become something real, and it was only beginning. They reached the ridge just before dusk, the jagged cliffs behind them casting long shadows that stretched like claws across the desert floor below. In the valley, the remains of the old mining relay shimmered faintly in the dying light, tall and rusted, and its signal dish slanted like a broken jawbone. Jack and Ra at the edge, both breathing heavy, their bodies ached from 3 days of walking, but the weariness wasn't only physical. It lived in the silence between them and the unasked questions. The weight of choice is still unmade. They made camp in the remnants of a collapsed cargo bay, metal ribs twisted into a half-dome, offering just enough shelter from the cold that would fall once the suns dropped fully behind the canyon wall. Jack lit the heat coil and set up the blanket rail, sat cross-legged a few feet away, unwrapping a ration pack. With slow fingers he watched her from the corner of his eye, something tightening in his chest. She hadn't spoken much that day. The night settled quickly, casting a blue hue over the rocks. The stars burned sharp overhead. Jack sat down across from her and passed her the second half of the food. She took it without a word. They ate quietly, but the silence felt different, now not comfortable, not peaceful. Heavy. Ra, he said softly. She looked up. Something still between us. She didn't deny it. Jack leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I don't need your whole story, but I need to know why you were out there alone, hurt, why you look like you expected no one to come. Ra didn't answer at first. Then she placed her food aside and pulled her legs and close to her chest, arms wrapping around them. Her posture shrank slightly, less poised, like alien, more real. I haven't told you because once I do, things change, she said quietly, and I was afraid of that. Jack waited. She exhaled a long, slow breath. My people are called Venari. We come from a world of seas and stormlight. We evolved to feel everything: sound, motion, energy. But we build our society on control. Emotion is dangerous to us. It floods us. So we learned to suppress, to silence. Jack didn't interrupt, just listened. I was chosen for a first observation team. My role was sensory linguistics, understanding how humans express emotion through words, tone, rhythm. We don't speak the way you do. Not with weight. We communicate in patterns, resonance. You weaponize words, and yet you heal with them too. She looked up. I was fascinated by that. Jack's brows drew together. So you were studying us? Yes, secretly, non-con protocol. I was assigned here on Salve with 2 others. We were to observe from a distance. We set up a cloak station in the high cliffs. Drones, sound maps, long-range imaging. We weren't supposed to intervene. What happened, Jack asked. The storm, the one that destroyed your sea tower. It tore through our ridge. We were scattered. My team lost contact. I think they may be gone. Jack inhaled sharply And you were alone, she nodded, I knew of it. Scavenger team operating in the canyon's unauthorized miners dangerous, but I thought if I stayed hidden, I could survive near them, watch them steal power if needed. But I got too close, they saw me, her voice dropped. They didn't speak to me, they didn't ask questions. They just set the trap, mechanical, barbed, crude. Effective, they left me there, maybe. They thought I'd die, maybe. That was the point. Jack's jaw clenched. I lost my transmitter, my emergency beacon. I couldn't reach anyone, so I screamed. I thought maybe the planet would take me quietly. I didn't expect to. There was silence again, but this time it was alive, charged with the weight of everything between them. You said nothing when I found you, Jack murmured. Not even when I carried you. I couldn't speak your words. Then my translator was broken, and even if it had worked, I didn't know if I should, but you did. I had to. She whispered, because you didn't treat me like a subject or an enemy. You treated me like a person. Jack stared into the fire, jaw tight. My brother died out here, he said. Finally, Storm got a ship just like yours, and after that I stopped trusting anyone. I stopped believing in connection. He looked at her. But then you just kept showing up, even bleeding, even scared. You didn't run. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. I wanted to. I'm glad you didn't. He looked down at their joined hands. You said earlier your people don't touch casually. She nodded. Touch is a bond, eh? Promise we don't do it lightly. Jack held her hand tighter. And what is this now? She leaned in, forehead resting gently against his. This is me choosing you. He closed his eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper. Even if I'm never allowed to return, even if I'm exiled, I'd still choose you. Jack's breath caught. I don't know what we are, what this is, but I've never felt more sure of anything, he said. She smiled, her voice trembling. You're not a subject to me either. You're home. Then she kissed him, not with desperation, but with certainty, their fingers laced. Breath met breath, and in that kiss there were no planets, no rules, no exile, only two people who had finally stopped running. Later, as they lay side by side beneath the stars, Jack whispered, you don't have to go back, you can stay. I know, she said. I will. And that night, in the space between survival and sunrise, something finally healed, not with silence, but with truth. The night was colder than the ones before, a biting kind of cold that settled deep, not just in the air, but in the pauses between words. The fire burned low between them, casting flickers of orange across the twisted metal of their makeshift shelter. The old mining station loomed in the distance, close enough to feel real now. No longer a distant goal, but something waiting to be reached. Jack sat with his back against a fractured support beam, one knee drawn up, the other stretched out toward the fire. His eyes were fixed on the flames, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Ra sat across from him, legs folded beneath her arms wrapped around her middle, as if holding something, and she hadn't spoken since they made camp. Neither had he. Not really. The silence wasn't empty, it was expectant. Jack finally spoke. We're close. Ra nodded slowly. I know. Tomorrow we reach the tower, then we send the signal. A long pause followed. Neither of them moved. Jack's voice was quieter when he said, and then what? Rayla's gaze lifted to meet his. Her silver eyes caught the fire light and reflected it back, steady, unreadable but not cold. I don't know, she said. You said you'd be exiled if you returned. I would. You could stay. I could. He waited, but she didn't finish the thought. Instead, she looked away to the dark beyond the rocks. Her hands trembled slightly. Just once Jack noticed. What are you afraid of? He asked gently. She took a breath. That this what we have won't survive the world outside this desert. That it's only alive here in silence and survival when the world comes back, when voices return and rules catch up to us. What happens to this? Jack looked at her for a long time, then he said, nothing's going to make me forget what we've been through. I don't want to go back to who I was before I met you. I can't. She met his eyes. Neither can I. Jack shifted forward, leaning his elbows on his knees. You said something the night before last, he said. That you weren't supposed to want this. Ray gave a faint nod. I think I was always supposed to want this, he said, but I never thought I deserved it. The words hung there, then slowly Rhea stood. She crossed the space between them and sat beside him, not opposite, but close there. Shoulders touched. I've never chosen someone before, she said quietly. He turned to her, brow creased. What do you mean? We're not like you, my people. We don't build our lives on partnerships. We're solitary by nature. Collectives work through function, not emotion. The idea of choosing someone because you feel something, it's strange, beautiful. Frightening Jack's voice was low. It's frightening for us too. She glanced at him. But you still do it, yeah, he said. Because sometimes it's the only thing that's real. Ra reached out and took his. Hand fingers intertwining with his. Then this is real, he nodded, the most real thing I've had in years. She leaned her head against his shoulder, exhaling softly. Then I'll stay. Jack went still. She looked up at him. I want to stay with you if you'll have me. He laughed almost. Breathless, you're asking me if I want you to stay. I don't want to assume. Jack cued her face with one hand, thumb brushing over her cheek. I don't want to wake up without you next to me. Her eyes shimmered, and then for the second time. But with none of the hesitation, she kissed him. This one wasn't about fear or survival or even comfort. It was something else. It was a promise. When they finally pulled apart, her voice was soft. Then it's decided. Jack nodded. We'll send the signal. Let them come. We'll choose our own path after that. No matter what they say, no matter what they say. They curled up beside each other beneath the remains of the sky, the fire between them flickering lower now, but they didn't need it for warmth anymore. The next day would bring the outside world crashing back in, but tonight belonged only to them, and for the first time since they'd met, they both believed whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning came slowly. It broke not with light, but with silence, the kind that wraps around you gently. No storm, no urgency, no fear, just stillness after days of dust. Storms fractured sleep and whispered uncertainty. It felt almost surreal. Jack woke first. He lay still beneath the thermal blanket, watching the fire's last embers curl into the pale orange air. Was curled beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, one hand lightly gripped around his shirt, her breathing even and warm. He watched her for a while, taking in the simple truth of her presence, that she was here, that she hadn't run, that he hadn't pushed her away. The sky above had shifted shades, leaned her at the edges, fading into a soft amber wash. The first sun was already above the ridge, casting long shadows behind the mining tower. In the distance, it loomed like a relic of an old world. But today it marked the end of their journey. He stirred slightly, and Ra opened her eyes. She blinked at him sleepily, her expression unguarded in a way he'd never seen before. For a few moments they didn't say anything. There was no need. Then she whispered, "It's time." He nodded. They broke camp with a kind of reverence, quiet, unhurried, but not hesitant. Every motion held weight. They packed the last of their supplies, doused the fire, and set out toward the tower. The desert was still, as if the planet itself was watching them. The walk was only an hour, but it felt longer. The relay station rose up ahead like the last page of story. Neither of them wanted to end. The dish was still intact, tilted, weather-worn, but structurally sound. Jack scanned the base and found the backup panel beneath a collapsed walkway with railers. Help he PRI it open, revealing a narrow control console. Blinking softly in standby. Hope he exhaled. Think it still works? Ra asked. Behind him, Jack crouched to examine the core. It's alive. I can patch a pull signal. It'll piggyback on the old mining bandwidth, short, tight, encrypted. Enough to tell someone we're alive, and enough to tell them I'm here. He glanced back at her. Yeah, that too. She was quiet for a long moment. Then do it. Jack worked in silence, his hands steady as he rerouted, power fingers moving with practiced ease. Ra stood beside him, watching not his hands but his face, like she was memorizing it. The signal engaged with a low hum, and the console lit up. A quiet ping echoed through the tower. Jack leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. Message sent. If they're a patrol saddle in range, someone will get it. Ra sat down beside him, folding her legs beneath her. The breeze tugged at her braid. Her skin glowed faintly in the morning light. I keep thinking, she said, about what I'll be if I go back. Jack didn't interrupt. They'll question me, strip my credentials, maybe exile me, maybe worse. I broke the directive. I made contact. I bonded. She looked at him, voice after now. But even if they let me return, I wouldn't be the same. He studied her face. What if we disappear instead? Her eyebrows lifted. Disappear? There's an old supply outpost North Ridge. It's not on most maps anymore. Still has power, water. I used to check on it during relay repairs. It's abandoned, but livable. You want to hide? I want a choice, he said, for both of us. No governments, no orders, just us. Ra looked down at her hands. I never imagined I'd want something so quiet. Do you? She looked at him, then really looked. I want you. The words struck him like a sunrise behind the eyes. He sat back slowly. You're sure? She nodded, and there was no Hesitation, where you go, I'll go, she said. He closed his eyes for a moment. Overwhelmed, then he reached for her hand, took it gently, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. You know, he said when I came to. This planet I was just trying to disappear, she smiled softly. Then you failed, yeah, he. Breath, thank God, they stood together in the shadow of the relay station, hand in hand, watching the blinking pulse of the signal fade into the sky. They waited an hour, then two, but no reply came, no patrol, no extraction, no warning, and they were both okay with that. When the suns were high, they turned north away from the tower, toward the place Jack had spoken of. They walked side by side, not looking back behind them. The signal continued to blink in his space, fading unanswered, but they no longer needed permission to begin again. They were already doing it together. The outpost was nothing more than a cluster of low rust-street buildings, wedged between sandstone cliffs and the edge of a wide canyon, but to them it was sanctuary. 3 weeks had passed since they turned away from the world. 3 weeks of no signals, no orders, no voices, but their own. And for the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel like he was running from anything. He wasn't just surviving, he was living in moments, in gestures, in her presence. The days were simple. Jack restored what he could: power relays, water collectors, solar grid notes, cataloged the land, recording sounds and wildlife patterns with a scientist's curiosity and an artist's awe. She mapped the canyons with charcoal and old data tablets. Her hair had faded to a softer green under the twin suns, and her skin held the warmth of the place now, like she belonged to the desert more than to the stars. Sometimes they worked side by side, other times in silence, but always close, always aware of each other. And the nights were theirs. They slept together in the old observation chamber, blankets layered on a repurposed cot, its window cracked open to the sky. Jack would lie awake just to watch the rise of the twin moons over the ridge. Ra's breath soft against his chest, her fingers sometimes tangled with his. She had stopped talking about her people. He had stopped counting the days since Earth. One morning, Jack stood outside at dawn, shirt open, hands resting on a railing overlooking the valley. The suns were just beginning to climb, twin arcs of gold and red carving light across the rock. He heard her footsteps behind him. She slipped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her head between his shoulder blades. You always rise before me, she murmured. I like watching the world turn before it gets loud, he said, smiling. She moved to his side. It's never loud here, not anymore. They stood like that, shoulder to shoulder, gazing at the new day stretching open in front of them. The canyon below stirred with wind and soft echoes, nothing else. Then she looked up at him, lips parted, eyes shimmering with something unspoken. Say it, she whispered. Jack turned to face her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I love you, he said without hesitation. I think I've loved you since the moment you leaned against me under those stars. Ross smiled, something luminous and wild behind it. She reached up and cradled his face in her hands. I love you too, Jack, she said, her voice clear, soft, and sure. Even before I knew your words, I knew you. He pulled her in gently, and this time their kiss wasn't rushed or desperate or stolen between breaths. It was patient, deep, a kiss born of choice, of everything they'd survived, of everything still waiting for them. When they parted, foreheads pressed together, hearts quiet and steady, she whispered, we built this. He nodded from nothing, and now he smiled. Now we build more. They stood there as the suns rose, fully painting the cliffs in gold, lighting the sky with the promise of another day. Not a day to escape, not a day to fight, but a day to live together forever if they chose. And in that moment they did.